mind coming up and introducing our guest speaker for today?
Thank you, Jacob. Right before Jacob started speaking up here, he said, "Randy, would you introduce our speaker?" And I said, "Well, I'm glad I'm dressed for it." Our speaker today is Susan Brooks, a relative of John Scopes. I met Susan indirectly through her relatives in Paducah, where John Scopes was born and stayed a lot. And I was, as I've done here many times, I was up in Paducah snooping around, and word got back to her family, and they contacted her. Suddenly I get an email from Susan, and we talk, and it's produced. She first came here three years ago, and I've been fascinated by the materials she has about the Scopes group. It's hard to come up with new things about John Scopes, but you're certainly going to see them today. Pictures you've never seen, and information about his family. So Susan, tell us about the Scopes family.
Thank you all for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today. I'm just going to give you some background about my family and family history. I've always been interested in and aware of the trial and general family history, but it's only been in the last 2 decades that I really began to look at the social and cultural impacts of the trial on my family, because it primarily directly affected me. When my husband and I considered naming our 4th son, we were going to use Scopes as his middle name after my grandfather and grandmother. My in-laws were aggressively against using that name. They were adamant that it would burden him, and that his name would cause him to be shunned by people that he interacted with for the remainder of his life. When I discussed it with my grandmother, she sadly agreed, and said that that was the case for my grandfather at times. And as a result, we decided not to name him after my grandfather, but it was always, an issue that that sparked a lot of conversation in my family. So this is a picture that you've probably all seen before, but while the trial was one of several examples of service and that happened by members of my family, it was service as it was a core tenet, basically, of our family ideology. Historically, John's role in the trial has been questioned. He agreed to serve, and why he agreed to serve as a defendant, and the extent of his role in the defense. Hypotheses ranged from, him just being innocent or ignorant bystander to him being a determined and central player. Each of those theories is likely true of John at some point during the trial and in the subsequent years. However, one aspect not previously explored was of his family and the way that he was raised, which is what I'm planning to talk with you about some today. John's father, Thomas Scopes, was a first-generation immigrant to the United States. He was from Suffolk, England. And in his own words, he was a dissenter by habit. He was stoic, yet opinionated and outspoken, a man who fought for what he believed in. Thomas was central in the establishment of family traditions and identity, and heavily influenced John as a young man. Subsequently, his social, political, and religious beliefs had a lasting effect on family identity for generations. Thomas was, as I said, born in Suffolk in 1860 to William and Mary Lucas Scopes, and he was the 7th of 8 children. His father died when he was 5 years old and never remarried. His siblings were from an educated, working-class family, and he often discussed with his children and grandchildren his own ideas about education, stressing the importance of formal and informal learning. He told them about a close friend who was a professor that lived nearby and provided him with books and directed his education outside of formal schooling. When Thomas immigrated to the United States, the only extra personal pieces that he brought with him at all was a Bible and an image of a man, a tin image. And the assumption from family members is that this was a photo of either his father, which no one has a photograph of that we're aware of, or this professor, which we no longer have the name of. But according to family stories, Thomas really only intended to come to America on tramp, as he called it. He was going to find a job and explore the country for a few years and then go back home. He left England from Liverpool and entered the United States in Philadelphia, and he went to work for the Illinois Central Railroad as a machinist and worked for several railroad yards along the line in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi. The railroad machinist modified and created unique parts, usually metal, to repair or maintain railroad equipment. According to family stories, Thomas made a special bell for Casey Jones's train. Jones was the engineer for the passenger train, the Cannonball Express, who was killed in a wreck with a freight train in Mississippi in 1900. And I think there are a few songs and about that. Thomas, while he was in the U.S., met Mary Ava Brown in Fulton County, Kentucky. She was the daughter of a prominent Presbyterian minister. They married in 1885 and had 6 children over the next 15 years. Thomas was naturalized in 1899, and he and Mary Alva purchased their home on Burger Road in Paducah, Kentucky in 1900. It's not showing my things in the right order. So I've heard several family stories about how, especially when Mary Alva was pregnant, the railroad workers would send messages up and down the lines to let Thomas know exactly what she wanted from home, or for him to bring home to her. Early in their marriage, Thomas was very active in her family's church, serving as a deacon in the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. He attempted to integrate basically into the religious customs of her family and community, but that was fairly short-lived. He ended up breaking from the church, that church, over an ideological conflict when church leaders took up a community project to remove the area of immoral women. Thomas argued at the church for helping the women economically in opposition to the church plan of forcing the women out of town. He stated that he felt that the moral and ethical response was to provide economic security and support so the women could become acceptable members of society. However, Mary Alva maintained a very public presence in the community. They were regularly mentioned in the newspaper. For example, notations in the Paducah Sun informed of events that they participated in, visitors to their home, and trips to and from Fulton County to visit her family, as well as trips that Thomas took up to Chicago for business. In 1907, there are notes in the paper where Thomas ended up taking a leave of absence from work, and in 1909, where he suffered an eye injury working on the job, cutting cylinder casings, and was treated at the local Illinois Central Hospital. Thomas was also very active in the community. He advocated for graded public schools throughout the area. His strong belief in education and learning were also reflected in actions within his own family. His children were well educated, both at home and within formal schools. Thomas read to them from a very young age on a wide variety of literary and scientific publications that ranged from Charles Darwin to Dickens, Mark Twain, and Jack London. And according to Leela, the youngest daughter, Thomas always warned them against accepting any information that they read without questioning it. Of Thomas and Mary Alice's children, they all graduated from high school, and 4 of the 5 went on to finish college degrees. They were also heavily involved in community service and professionally as teachers. For example, Irene Scopes was a member of the first graduating class of Western Kentucky University. She was a prominent member of the Paducah Women's Club, and as a teacher was active in parent-teacher associations and pivotal in developing a city lunch program. Leela Scopes was also a teacher. She graduated from Murray State University and was active in developing a local day nursery program in town. She was also a longtime member of the Lourdes Hospital Auxiliary and the National Federation of Music Club. Thus, with respect to education, the Scopes were well respected within the community, and the expectation of children being well-read and obtaining a broad education beyond high school was continued by the subsequent generations of the family. Thomas was also a committed activist with regard to the labor movement. During the 1890s, as well as in the first 2 decades of the 1900s, conflicts over individual liberties and the establishment of social standards were often at the forefront of family and public discussions. The progressive era was in full swing in the United States, and progressive-minded reformers, typically upper and middle-class white Americans, prepared to restrain individual liberties for the good of the nation. It was during this time that Thomas became heavily involved with the International Association of Machinists and with the American Railway Union. In fact, he was fired during the 1894 Pullman strike for refusing to stand as a strike breaker. While he was subsequently hired back, this sympathetic support of the Pullman workers reflected his willingness to act in response to his personal beliefs. His involvement in the strike also addressed his willingness to accept some level of personal cost within the community for acting on his beliefs and values in the hope of influencing other people and policies. The sense of obligation, both to the project and to the act on one's values, is also seen in his willingness to run for political offices in the local Socialist Labor Party ticket. In 1901 as a city judge, and in 1904, if I can go forward, he received 596 votes according to the official vote count of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. This reflects on his and his family's support of the Pullman strike and activity within labor unions. His early knowledge and association with Eugene Debs and Clarence Darrow. Eugene Debs founded the American Railway Union in 1893 as a way to achieve unity across skill lines and protect the railway workers, their pay, and their working conditions for management. When Pullman workers were fired after filing a grievance with the company, thousands of workers from the railroads across the Midwest boycotted as a sign of solidarity any of the Pullman sleeping cars that used them. This previous association with Debs and knowledge of Darrow is important when it comes into play the selection of Darrow as John's attorney in 1925. The association with Debs is confirmed by an article in the Paducah Sun, which reports that nearly 3,600 people heard Eugene V. Debs, I can't talk today, unfold socialism in its true light in the auditorium on 19th Street. and Broadway last night. The speaker was accorded warm applause from the beginning to the conclusion of his address. Thomas Scopes, a local socialist, made a few telling preliminary remarks and introduced Mr. Debs, who was twice the presidential nominee for the Socialist Party. This is relevant not just because he was involved, but because he openly shared his opinion with his family and included the children, especially Leela and John. So in addition to actively working to expose others in Paducah to the socialist ideas he believed, he worked to influence policy locally and within the union. Thomas served as a voting delegate for the Machinist Union during the Illinois Central and Harriman line strikes from 1911 to 1915. This strike was unusual in that it was portrayed as an ideological stand in support of the creation of a federation for craft unions. Individual craft unions had attempted several unsuccessful strikes as a means to provide security and standardization of rates across the line for employees. However, when a group of craft unions in Missouri joined the machinists on strike and were successful in 1910, it laid the groundwork for other rail lines to oppose a larger federation. The resulting strike of the Illinois Central and Harriman lines was based on the idea that some workers would have to take the first step in creating a unified group so others would ultimately be protected against management. And the strike lasted for 45 months and involved 38,000 men. At some point during 1913, Thomas ended up taking another job with the railroad, with the Chicago and Eastern Illinois Railroad. There he worked for two of the major yards from 1913 to 1915. He worked in the Brewer Yard in Danville, Illinois, and in 1915 he was transferred to the Salem Yard in Salem, Illinois. Only the two youngest children, Leela V. and John Scopes, in our family, he basically goes by JT. Nobody calls him John or John Thomas, but so they went with Mary Alvin Thomas to Illinois. While living in Danville, John noted that he and Leela were considered Southerners, so they were placed at the front of the classroom with the two African American kids. The move to Salem, Illinois, put them back in a community that they believed was more in line with what they were used to in Paducah. A place that, according to John, regarded social conventions as holy writ and its thought patterns were characterized by group conformity. Thus, Salem became yet another location where the Scopes were viewed by many as unorthodox. Living in Salem also put the Scopes family directly in the path of William Jennings Bryan. Bryan, who was born in Salem and often returned to visit and give speeches on the political and religious views, also had just recently resigned as U.S. Secretary of State in June of 1915, just prior to the Scopes moving to town. While Thomas did not agree with all of Bryan's views, he did believe the United States, and specifically his son John, should remain out of the fight. The societal adjustments after World War I affected most people, and a general dissatisfaction by citizens, ideological discrepancies between big businesses and unions, and an economic recession led to riots and strikes in cities across the nation. Many people, specifically minorities, experienced job loss after the war. This, in conjunction with riots and citywide strikes in Seattle and Boston in 1919, caused an overall fear of unions and led to the Great Red Scare. These elements, in addition to postal bombings of wealthy Americans, led to the creation of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which resulted in increased surveillance and other actions against perceived threats to the nation by radical unionists and communists. Government leaders depicted these events as a direct result of socialism in America, and they focused investigations on immigrants, minority groups, and union leaders, deporting many Americans and stripping them of citizenship. In the midst of these post-war changes, Thomas became much less visible with the Union and the Socialist Party. His children were finishing up high school and college, and he spent his last few years working with the railroad. Just prior to Thomas's retirement, John graduated from high school, and William Jennings Bryan delivered the commencement speech. While Bryan was well known for being a master orator, his speech also followed a sermon given by a minister with false teeth that made a whistling noise when he tried to pronounce words with an S. And Bryan unfortunately made a whistling noise during his speech, which caused a group of students, including John, to burst out laughing. Bryan was quick to remind John and his father Thomas of that moment when he sat with them at dinner in Dayton a few nights before the trial was supposed to start. After John graduated from high school, he went to the University of Illinois for 1 year, became ill with severe bronchitis, and laid out for several years, going back and graduating in 1924. That summer, he was offered a teaching position here in Dayton. And as you're all familiar with the trial, we won't go into that in a lot of detail, but one thing that his sister said that was about, his sister Leela said about his decision to take the coaching position here in Dayton was that she shared her brother's convictions on evolution. This was from an article a few years later. But that John told her that he was taking the teaching position in Dayton because it's a small town with a small school where I won't get in any deep water. We know how well that worked for him. In the publicity and international debates sparked by the trial. In his autobiography, John said that when he went home to Paducah and told his family about the upcoming trial, that his father was very proud of him. He was happy that he was participating in an event that he felt would be of service to the whole country. He went on to say that his father viewed his struggle as he did. He knew that freedom was at stake, freedom of religion, freedom to teach, freedom to think and to believe, and he considered the trial to be just as much his as mine. This was an important sentiment and speaks to the degree of influence Thomas's belief system had on John. John's early comments to the press also reflect that he held a similar ideology to that of Thomas. Comments that John made early on were picked up by the press and led to his being warned against tainting the defense with radicalism. While this was not something that John Scopes' view alone would have accomplished, the pre-trial publicity was enormous. The press was reporting on the potential of the prosecution to discredit the ACLU by pointing to its support of pacifism and radicalism during World War I. In addition, groups and individuals worldwide were taking a stand on issues of the trial that were using the people involved as symbols for their opinions. Personal attacks against the members of both the prosecution and the defense teams were prominent, as were attacks against John. For example, the New York World declared that Scopes supporters included atheists, free thinkers, free lovers, socialists, and the communists. And a prominent Brooklyn minister claimed Scopes was an ambassador of the devil. The barrage of attention alternately bothered and amused Scopes. His concerns were concerns over his being very naive with regard to the journalists. And that also allowed him to stay with his family in Paducah for much of the pre-trial period. As we heard yesterday in the play, How It Started, John did have to meet with the ACLU Executive Committee in New York shortly after his indictment to assist in the formulation of the trial strategy and the assignment of the defense team. Clarence Darrow had volunteered to serve as a defense lawyer, but the committee was divided on whether or not he was the right choice for the trial. With the ACLU already being targeted in the press, they feared that he would add an additional radical element. When asked, however, Scopes was clear that he wanted Darrow to serve as a primary defense lawyer. The ACLU Executive Committee didn't want Darrow, considering him to be radical, but Scopes stated in his autobiography that the committee asked who he wanted, and he told them that he wanted Darrow because with Bryan serving as primary for the prosecution, they needed someone who could equal his skill and charisma. It is likely that though his father's association with unions, Eugene Debs, and socialism, that John already knew and had an opinion about Darrow's skill as a defense lawyer. So the arguments against Darrow by the committee fell on deaf ears. John's trial only lasted 8 days, but Thomas and his friend E. Haldeman Julius joined John here in Dayton before the trial began. While in Dayton, Thomas aggressively avoided being photographed, although he was known by all of the locals to share his opinions readily. Whether it was in jest or in all seriousness, Mary Ava had warned Thomas that she did not want him to end up in the newspapers again while he was in Tennessee. He was there to support JT and to see that nothing untoward happened to John. John made note in his autobiography, Center of the Storm, that neither he nor his father wanted to be caught in the Louisville paper because Mary Ava read that paper daily. The Scopes trial inspired an exceptional amount of media coverage and the equivalent of 900,000 print pages, according to sociologist Harold Odom, who claimed that no periodical of any sort ignored the subject. Books were dedicated to John, editorials and cartoons, filled the newspapers and radio programs, and songs recounted the issues of the trial. Harry Fairfield Osborne dedicated his book, The Earth Speaks to Brian, to John. The book was released just prior to the trial. Additionally, several songs were written about the trial that came to be known as Scopes songs. The most famous being the John T. Scopes trial by Vernon Dalhart. The media coverage did not stop completely at the end of the trial, and neither did the telegrams or the mounds of mail from all over the world. John received thousands of letters, most of which remained unread. Of the ones he did read, however, he found an offer to be given a position as the Bishop of Tennessee by a small liberal church, letters wanting to save him, offers of marriage, financial offers if he allowed the use of his name or appeared at functions, and one that he especially enjoyed from the Norwegian Students Association, congratulating him for teaching the truth, annoying hypocrites, and fighting the big boo. Ultimately, he and two of his friends took all of the letters, enough to fill one bedroom and the front porch, into the yard and burned it. He decided that he had no interest in living in the spotlight and became determined to seek anonymity, a choice that he stated his father, Thomas, heartily approved. Anonymity was not an attainable goal, however. John remained in the public eye, and more accurately, it was the symbol that his name had become through the plethora of social and cultural issues surrounding the trial that was used to address what remained in the media and continued to spark controversy. The issues of academic freedom through the control of public schools and the content of textbooks, as well as the variety of debates over religion versus science, are well known and still under debate. Other cultural and societal debates over topics such as eugenics, racial hierarchy, feminism, and nativism also drew upon the Scopes trial to support their claims, both for and against. That this one trial created so much controversy and continues to remain relevant today all harkens back to the culmination of people, place, and ideas that coalesced in this one event. Historian Adam Shapiro notes that the fate of John Scopes was important not just to the 1,800 people of Dayton, but also to the world, because the locality of Dayton became universalized, and legal proceedings in the courthouse became a spectacle immortalized at the Scopes trial. The notoriety brought by the trial followed John throughout his graduate schools and resulted in him leaving his doctoral program at the University of Chicago after the second year. In his autobiography, John states that the president of the university administering the endowment for the fellowship put a rude note and a rude end to my hopes, finishing my doctoral work without interruption. He wrote, "Your name has been removed from consideration for the fellowship. As far as I'm concerned, you can take your atheist medals and play elsewhere." John took a position with Gulf Oil in South America in 1928 and was stationed in Venezuela. He fell sick, and after recovering, he and his father Thomas took a trip back to England to visit family. This was Thomas's first trip home since 1885, and during the trip, John noticed that he lost his most cherished stereotypes of the English people. He continued with an interesting description of the English Scopes family, stating that they were all good, ordinary people, very level-headed with a proper balance of emotions. They were substantial citizens who helped build a nation. There were no religious fanatics. Of his father, John noted that Thomas was very happy to see his family and native land again. After John and Thomas returned to the United States in 1929, John went back to Venezuela, met his future wife, Mildred Walker, and converted to Catholicism prior to marriage, which sparked another round of publicity. John responded to the evoking of the need for an undivided family. He referred to his conversion as a necessary hoop, stating that he was just another penguin. When he asked if she had previously known about John and the trial, Mildred told reporters that she had and that her aunt thought Scopes was something with horns. I never dreamed I would meet and marry him. Nevertheless, they married, horns and all. Let's see. So the Scope does, in the years following the trial, John continuously faced the censure of others who, because of the name association, viewed him as a focal point of the trial. He was not the only person in the family affected by the publicity raised by issues associated with the trial, though. His sister Leela, a high school math teacher in Western Kentucky, was asked to resign her position. Others in the family simply had to adjust to the disapproval and suspicion by some in the community. Even today, when the trial is discussed, it's not uncommon for some family members to attempt an explanation of the distance between faith and science, for some to begin with phrases like, the Scopes are just not atheists. So this is a way to remove the perceived ideological difference that some are feeling in their communities. As one historian, Adam Shapiro, notes, the publicity and events surrounding the trial, along with the historically based Scopes trial play, Inherit the Wind, it submitted the name Scopes, becoming a label of derision employed by those who saw evolution as a religious and immoral doctrine. The Scopes name does symbolize a variety of ideas about academic freedom, religion, and science for many people worldwide. However, it's the navigation between these perceptions of Scopes to an actual family identity that is most telling. Thomas Scopes provided the foundation for the development of the traits and tradition of the family. The willingness to stand up for an idea or a belief is very important. Thomas set the stage through his own actions and dedication to his social, religious, and political beliefs that subsequently allowed John to do the same. This nonconformist or tenacious and altruistic, depending upon your perception, behavior was also seen by the sisters Ethel, Irene, and Nanny Mae during the Ohio River flood of 1937, as described in Ethel's unpublished manuscript, Room for One More, about her family's efforts to provide aid to family and friends during the flood. The entire family remained in Paducah, along with Thomas and Mary Alva, against very strong suggestions or orders, depending upon how you want to take that, by the National Guard to assist and house others stranded by the flood. These events and affiliations offer an interesting look at a middle-class Western Kentucky family, the tensions inherent in small-town living, and the reconciliation of the assumed or culturally created Scopes with the actual family dynamics and identity. I didn't flip through all of my pictures because it wasn't connected, but these are some other family photos that are probably difficult to see where you are, but this is the house on Burger Road in Kentucky with family members, and so is this in the back. And these are John's 4 sisters. This is Leela, who you heard Randy Moore talk about a few years ago. This is my grandmother, and Ethel And this is the Four Sisters as well. Again, this is at the preview of Inherent the Wind in Paducah, out in front of the big theater. So, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them as best I can.
So you are the great niece?
Right.
I'm
I have to literally look at it. I think I understood.
saying.
John was my mother's uncle.
Okay.
Thank you.
Your family, the Scopes family, and it provided us great context that we don't usually get when we think about the Scopes family, so we really appreciate it. That concludes our meeting today. We do have copies of the most recent publication of Rhea Notes if you want to pick up a copy before you leave. Our next meeting will be September 19th at 2:30, same spot here in the courthouse.